When the woman arrived at the showroom, no one looked twice except for the man behind the counter, who looked too hard. In her faded jeans and a soft white tee, she didn't exactly match the usual clientele of a high-end dealership. He gave her a quick glance, the kind that judged and dismissed all at once. "Ma'am," he said with a smirk, gesturing casually toward the glass doors, "these cars start at $300,000. A few employees nearby chuckled under their breath. Customers turned their heads. She didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She simply turned around and walked out, her silence louder than any response. The next morning, the scene flipped. A jet-black Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled to a stop in front of the very same dealership, its surface gleaming like liquid obsidian under the sun. The staff turned their heads this time too, but not to laugh. When the back door opened and the same woman stepped out, something in the room shifted. The man from yesterday stood frozen, his smugness draining from his face. Valencia Elite Motors, an upscale dealership nestled in the heart of Seattle, had always catered to the elite. Inside, glass walls framed a gallery of speed and luxury Ferraris, Bentleys, McLarens. It was a place where wallets spoke louder than words. But Isabel Hartley didn't come here to impress anyone. With her ponytail tied back and no makeup to speak of, Izzy's presence was quiet, yet unmistakably grounded. At 35, she walked with the certainty of someone who had nothing to prove. She wasn't interested in the flash. She had spent her life building something far more valuable, the Hartley Hope Foundation, a nonprofit that had changed thousands of lives for children with disabilities. What started as one woman's mission had become a nationwide movement of support, love, and transformation. And yet, none of that was visible from the outside. Her eyes locked on a deep blue coupe, positioned on a raised platform in the center of the showroom. It wasn't for her. It was for her sister, Rachel, a woman who had stared cancer in the face and won. With her 40th birthday around the corner, Izzy wanted to gift her something unforgettable, a symbol of resilience, of joy, of life after surviving the unthinkable. She could afford it easily, but wealth was never her identity. Kindness was. Across the room, Gavin Reed, the sales director, noticed her again. Same woman, same outfit, same air of modesty. He raised an eyebrow and leaned toward a colleague. "Here we go again," he murmured, amused. Before Izzy could approach the car, a young sales associate named Eli greeted her warmly. "Good morning. Anything I can help you explore today?" But Gavin stepped in, cutting the moment short. "I've got this one," he said smoothly, flashing a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Turning to Izzy, he added, "Looking for directions, ma'am?" Izzy's reply came without hesitation, light but clear. "Actually, no. I'm here for that midnight blue coupe." She pointed with a calm, assured finger. "That one." Gavin's smile faltered for the briefest moment. It was going to be a day he wouldn't forget, nor would anyone else in that showroom. "That's the Azure," Gavin said slowly, as though explaining something to a child. "Only 15 of them were manufactured this year." His tone carried a condescension he didn't bother to hide. "Perhaps you'd like to visit our pre-owned section. It's about 3 blocks east." His eyes swept over Izzy's outfit again, pausing at her well-worn sneakers. He didn't need to say what he was thinking. It was written all over his face. But Izzy had long grown used to that kind of scrutiny. She lived simply by choice, a quiet rebellion against the expectations that came with wealth. Freedom, to her, was found in authenticity. "I'm actually quite interested in this model," she replied with calm insistence, her voice steady. Would it be possible to take a look inside? Gavin's pleasant mask cracked just slightly. The Azure is shown by appointment only, he lied smoothly. We typically reserve viewings for clients with scheduled consultations. As if on cue, a sharply dressed couple entered the dealership, and Gavin's demeanor transformed like a stage actor mid-scene. Excuse me, he said abruptly, barely glancing at Izzy. Feel free to grab a brochure. Eli can help with that. He turned on his heel and glided toward the new arrivals, arms wide. Mr. and Mrs. Halston, what a pleasure to see you again. Left behind, Izzy was met with a sympathetic look from Eli. He couldn't have been more than 25, and his slightly oversized suit hinted that he was still new to this world. I'm really sorry about that, he said softly. Would you still like to hear more about the Azure? I would, thank you, Izzy replied warmly. As Eli launched into a detailed overview of the vehicle's specs, she noticed Gavin across the room, now escorting the Halstons directly to the Azure. With exaggerated flair, he opened the door and motioned for Mrs. Halston to step inside the very same vehicle he'd just said was off limits. Izzy glanced at Eli and offered a reassuring smile. It's all right. I understand how this works. Meanwhile, Gavin was deep in performance mode. This particular model, 8-month wait list, he said, voice low and confident. But I've set this one aside for our most distinguished clients. Mrs. Halston caressed the interior leather. It's beautiful, but I'm not sure about the color. We can absolutely discuss a custom finish, Gavin replied without missing a beat. Izzy approached quietly, stopping just a few feet away. Excuse me, she said gently. I was hoping to speak with someone about purchasing this model. Gavin turned toward her, his charm fading fast. As I mentioned, this vehicle is currently being shown to other clients, he said through clenched teeth. Perhaps you could return another time, or, as I mentioned, our pre-owned inventory is always available. The Halstons exchanged an awkward glance, clearly uncomfortable. I'm interested in this car, Izzy said again, her tone unwavering. It's for my sister's birthday next month. Gavin took a step back from the couple and lowered his voice, though the bitterness remained sharp. Look, he said, I get it, people like to dream. But this is a professional showroom. That car costs more than most people's homes. I've been patient, but you're disrupting a real transaction here. Around them, a hush began to fall. Several customers had paused to watch the exchange. Eli lingered nearby, visibly uneasy. I'm prepared to pay in full today, Izzy said, still composed, in cash. That was the breaking point. Gavin let out a dry, incredulous laugh that echoed across the glossy floor. A cash purchase? He repeated loudly, his voice designed to mock. This isn't a flea market. We're talking about $250,000. He turned slightly, addressing the room more than the woman in front of him. People who can afford this kind of car don't come in looking like that. He waved a dismissive hand at her jeans and sneakers. For a moment, the heat rising in Izzy's face felt familiar, not shame, but anger. Not for herself. She'd survived worse. But for every person who had been made to feel small in rooms like this, simply because they didn't fit someone else's version of wealth. And she wasn't done yet. Ever been judged by what you're wearing? Izzy asked softly. Because I have. But I believe my money holds the same value as anyone else's. Gavin stepped in closer, his frame towering over hers. His patience had clearly run out. Let me be perfectly clear, he said, voice colder now, stripped of any remaining courtesy. You're wasting my time and making a scene. If you want to be taken seriously, you can schedule an appointment, come back dressed properly, and then we'll talk. Otherwise, I suggest you leave." The entire showroom fell into a hush. The Halstons quietly stepped away from the vehicle, unease written across their carefully polished faces. And then a new voice cut through the silence. "Is there a problem here?" The man who had just entered was Richard Mason, the owner of Valencia Elite Motors. Drawn by the tension in the air, he approached calmly, but his eyes were sharp and observant. Gavin quickly straightened his tie. "No problem at all, sir," Gavin said quickly. "Just explaining our appointment-only policy to this lady." Richard turned his attention to Izzy, taking in her modest attire and the uncomfortable crowd that had formed. His expression gave little away, but the message beneath it was clear. He wasn't here to intervene, only to maintain appearances. "And your name, miss?" he asked curtly. "Isabel Hartley," she replied, steady despite the growing flush in her cheeks. "Well then, Miss Hartley," Richard said with a slight nod, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Our clients typically understand the exclusivity of the models we offer here." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Izzy said. Her voice didn't waver, though something inside her cracked. "Your sales manager has made the policies more than clear." Gavin stepped forward again, eager to reclaim control. "If you are genuinely interested," he said, layering sarcasm into every word, "you're welcome to call and arrange a proper appointment. Though I'd advise coming prepared with bank statements and perhaps a more appropriate outfit." He gestured broadly to the showroom around them. "These vehicles aren't for just anyone. They're for people who belong in a certain class." A soft ripple passed through the bystanders' part discomfort, part cruel amusement. Someone chuckled. Gavin stood proud, unaware or perhaps unconcerned by the weight of his words. Izzy looked around, at the faces, at Gavin's smug posture, at the silent approval of the man in charge. She had faced ignorance before, but rarely so naked, so public. "I see," she said quietly. There was no anger in her tone, just resolve. And though her dignity remained intact, her spirit carried the bruise of the moment. Without another word, she turned and walked out into the daylight. The glass doors closed behind her, but not before Gavin muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "Some people really don't know their place." Outside, Izzy exhaled and took a moment to steady herself. Then she pulled out her phone. The sting was still fresh, but a calm determination had begun to rise. A quiet smile formed as she dialed. Miles away, nestled on 5 serene acres just outside Seattle, the Hartley estate sat in quiet elegance, tasteful, intentional, and unassuming. Few would guess it belonged to one of the leading minds in sustainable tech innovation. At 41, Alexander Hartley had transformed the field of renewable energy storage. His work had earned him both fortune and acclaim, though he preferred a life out of the spotlight. Privacy was wealth to him. When Izzy entered his home office, he immediately set down his work. 15 years of marriage had taught him to read her face like a familiar book. Something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, standing from his desk and walking to her. Izzy sank into a nearby chair, the weight of the morning settling over her once more. "It was eye-opening," she said, attempting a small smile that faltered before it could take hold. She recounted the experience, every dismissive glance, every condescending word, Gavin's sneer, the owner's cold indifference, the sting of being judged so carelessly, so publicly. Alexander didn't interrupt. He listened fully, deeply. His jaw tightened, but he let her speak until she'd said it all. "It's not about me," Izzy said at last, her voice quieter now. "I'll be okay. I know who I am. But how many others walk into places like that, get treated like they're nothing, and carry that pain with no way to prove otherwise?" Alexander nodded slowly. He had always admired this about her, her ability to feel for others, even when she was the one who had been wounded. "So," he said gently, "what do you want to do about it?" Izzy looked out the window for a long moment. Part of her, truly, wanted to walk away. Let it go. But the other part, the one that had built a foundation from the ground up, the one that believed in dignity for all, was beginning to stir. "I could just get Rachel's gift somewhere else," Izzy admitted, her voice quiet but thoughtful. "But then I think about Eli. He treated me with decency. He didn't care about my shoes or my clothes. And I think about everyone who gets looked down on just because they don't look wealthy enough to be respected." She looked directly at Alexander, her gaze steady. "People like Gavin need to understand worth isn't something you wear. And I'm not looking for revenge. I want awareness." Alexander leaned back slightly, nodding with a slow, knowing smile as something clicked into place in his mind. "I believe," he said, "we can manage both." Izzy raised an eyebrow, nothing too theatrical, she warned, knowing her husband's tendency to go big when protecting her. "No buying the dealership and firing the entire staff?" she teased. Alexander chuckled. "Tempting, but no, nothing so cliché. I was thinking, maybe what they need is a little education." And so, side by side, they began shaping a plan. Not a scheme to humiliate, but a lesson to enlighten. Something more powerful than punishment, an experience that would stay with them long after. When the details were finalized, Alexander asked gently, "Are you sure you don't want to be there?" Izzy shook her head. "This isn't about me watching them get what they deserve. It's about helping them really see the kind of person they so quickly dismissed." Then she smiled. "But I do expect a full report." As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across their quiet estate, Alexander picked up the phone and made a few purposeful calls. The wheels were set in motion. Tomorrow would not be just another day at Valencia Elite Motors. It would be a day of reckoning, not in cruelty, but in clarity. A lesson not just for Gavin Reed, but for everyone who had ever assumed too much based on too little. The next morning was stunning clear skies, a gentle breeze, and sunshine that kissed the streets just right. Gavin walked into the showroom with his usual swagger, straightening his iconic navy blue tie as he went. The memory of yesterday's little incident still amused him. He'd laughed about it over drinks, retelling the story like a joke, another case of someone dreaming too far above their means. Inside, the showroom sparkled. Exotic vehicles shimmered beneath strategically placed lighting, each car positioned to seduce the eyes. Gavin had just wrapped up the morning staff briefing, emphasizing a familiar mantra. "Remember," he told the team, "qualify your clients early. We're not being snobbish, we're being efficient. Not everyone belongs in this market." Eli remained quiet throughout the meeting, clearly uncomfortable. Gavin made a mental note to coach him later about reading customers more accurately. Then, at exactly 10:17, the air in the room shifted. The hum of a powerful engine rolled through the open glass facade, pulling every head toward the entrance. Conversations dropped mid-word. A vehicle unlike anything they'd seen before glided to a stop just outside. Even Gavin, who was rarely impressed by the supercars he saw daily, felt his heartbeat quicken. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, extended wheelbase. But not just any Phantom, this one had been custom commissioned, finished in an extraordinary shade of midnight blue that seemed to change with the light, like a moving ocean beneath moonlight. By conservative standards, it was worth well over $1.2 million. Is that? Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, had stepped from his office, eyes fixed on the scene outside. Gavin nodded, already heading toward the front. "It's the Azure Phantom," he said under his breath. "Extremely rare spec." A professional chauffeur in a pristine uniform stepped out with practiced elegance, walked around the vehicle, and opened the rear passenger door with white-gloved grace. And from the car emerged a man who seemed to command the very air around him. Tall, composed, and dressed in a charcoal suit so meticulously tailored it didn't boast its worth, it whispered it. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his shoes mirror-polished, and his presence magnetic. The room fell into silence. Everyone, including Gavin, stood still watching, wondering. Because this man was here for a reason, and his arrival was only the beginning of a message no one in that showroom would soon forget. His posture was calm, yet commanding. There was no arrogance in the way he moved, just the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to. Gavin's instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't just another high-net-worth client. This was the kind of buyer luxury dealerships dreamed of, the kind who didn't just buy a car, but started long-term relationships worth millions. "Good morning, sir," Gavin called out smoothly, intercepting the guest before anyone else could. "Welcome to Valencia Elite Motors, Gavin Reed, sales manager. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today." The man gave him a measured look before offering a brief, polite smile, one that didn't quite warm his eyes. "Alexander Hartley," he said, extending a firm handshake. The name sparked something in Gavin's memory, but he couldn't quite place it. Not that it mattered. The custom Phantom parked outside had already confirmed the man's status. A client of this caliber didn't need a resume. "Mr. Hartley, what a privilege. May I show you our newest arrivals?" "We just received a limited." Alexander held up a hand gently, stopping him mid-pitch. "I'm here for something specific. The Azure Coupe. Midnight blue." Gavin's face lit up. "Ah, excellent taste, sir. Only 15 produced this year. It would be my honor to. I already know where it is," Alexander said evenly. "My wife came by yesterday to inquire about it." For a beat, Gavin faltered. He forced a smile. "Your wife? I don't recall. Perhaps one of our associates." "No," Alexander replied, his voice cool but unmistakably firm. "You spoke with her. Or rather, you chose not to. Isabel Hartley. She wore jeans and a white t-shirt. You suggested she check the used car section." A visible wave of realization swept over Gavin's face. Behind him, Eli audibly inhaled, his eyes wide. The air in the room seemed to thicken. I, Gavin stammered, the usual slickness in his voice slipping. "There must be some mix-up. We treat all our clients with the utmost." Just then, Richard Mason appeared, sensing trouble from across the room. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, glancing from Gavin to Alexander. "I assume you're Mr. Mason?" Alexander asked. "Yes, indeed. Richard Mason." "Welcome to Valencia Elite." "I was just explaining to your sales manager," Alexander interrupted, "that my wife was here yesterday. She wanted to purchase the Azure as a gift for her sister. But the way she was treated raises serious concerns." Richard's confident tone faltered. I I do recall being present briefly, but I wasn't aware of the full situation. Alexander's gaze remained steady. She was dismissed, based entirely on her appearance. Your manager made it quite clear that this place wasn't for people like her. The words hit the room like a sudden gust. Staff members, a few early customers, and even passing employees had stopped what they were doing. Silence bloomed in the space between them. Gavin opened his mouth. "Mr. Hartley, please, if there was any misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," a quiet voice said. All eyes turned to Eli, who looked startled by his own courage but didn't stop. Mrs. Hartley was respectful, clear about her interest, and treated poorly from the moment she walked in. Not because of anything she said, just because of what she was wearing. Gavin shot Eli a glare sharp enough to cut glass, but it was too late. The truth was already out, and no amount of spin could contain it. Alexander turned back to Richard Mason. "You know what's ironic?" he asked, voice calm. "My wife, who was deemed unworthy of basic courtesy, founded and runs the Hartley Hope Foundation. It provides life-changing services for children with disabilities." There was a long, still pause. "And the car she wanted?" Alexander continued. "It was a gift for her sister, who just survived breast cancer." You could hear a pin drop. What had started as a casual morning of showroom chatter had turned into something much larger, a confrontation not just with one man's prejudice, but with a culture of assumption built into the very air they breathed. And Alexander hadn't even raised his voice. "It's been her life's purpose since long before I met her," Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with quiet pride. "Izzy has raised over $50 million to fund specialized equipment and education programs for children with disabilities." He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle into the stillness of the room. She chooses to live simply by choice, not necessity. It's how she stays connected to the people she serves, to the families whose stories she carries with her every day. It's one of the many reasons I love her. Richard Mason looked as though the color had drained from his face. "Mr. Hartley," he began, flustered, "I assure you, what happened here doesn't reflect who we are as a company. We pride ourselves on your actions will say more than any mission statement," Alexander said, cutting him off gently but firmly. Then he turned slightly toward the Azure Coupe. "As for the car originally, I was only here to buy this one. It was meant to be a gift from my wife to her sister, as she intended." Gavin lifted his head slightly, clinging to a shred of hope. "But," Alexander continued, his tone shifting, "I had also been considering replacing the entire vehicle fleet for our company's 7 cars in total, and perhaps making a few additions to my personal collection as well." Richard's eyes widened. A transaction like that could fulfill their entire quarterly sales targets in a single day. But Alexander wasn't finished. "Now I find myself wondering whether this is the kind of place that deserves that level of trust or investment." The silence that followed was absolute. Gavin looked as though he might be physically sick. "Mr. Hartley, please," Richard said, almost pleading. "Let us make this right. This is not who we are." Alexander took a thoughtful breath. "Perhaps there's a path forward," he said slowly. "But it would require more than just selling me cars." "Anything," Richard responded quickly. "Whatever it takes." Alexander turned to Gavin. "The Hartley Hope Foundation is hosting a benefit gala next month. We're raising funds for a new adaptive sports complex for children with mobility challenges." Gavin swallowed. "I believe your presence there would be enlightening." He hesitated. As a guest? Alexander shook his head. As a volunteer. We always need help setting up, assisting the children, listening to their stories, seeing firsthand the kind of work my wife and her team are doing. The message was clear. This wasn't about retribution. It was about reflection. And, Alexander added, turning back to Richard, perhaps it's time your staff participated in training around unconscious bias. I know some excellent consultants I'd be happy to connect you with. Richard nodded vigorously. Absolutely. That would be welcomed. Then Alexander turned toward Eli, the only one who had spoken up when it mattered. I'd like you to handle all the paperwork. Start with the Azure. It's going to my sister-in-law. Eli blinked, stunned. Me? Thank you, sir. It would be an honor. Good, Alexander said, his voice final but warm. Now, shall we discuss the company fleet? As they began walking toward Mason's office, Alexander paused in front of the Azure coupe. He ran a hand gently along its elegant curve. My wife, he said softly, has excellent taste. Behind him, Gavin Reed stood completely still. His world, once orderly, predictable, and ruled by surface impressions, had been upended. He had exposed something far deeper than ignorance. He had revealed who he truly was by the way he treated someone he assumed didn't matter. 1 month later, the Hartley Hope Foundation Gala turned the historic Crescent Hotel into a celebration of courage, resilience, and community. Children with various disabilities laughed and played in the decorated ballroom, surrounded by families, medical professionals, and generous supporters. The air pulsed not with formality, but with joy. Near the entrance, a man stood quietly, not in a designer suit, but in a simple volunteer's uniform. He directed guests with quiet focus and gently assisted a young boy in a wheelchair to the photo booth. That man was Gavin Reed. And though no one made a spectacle of it, those who knew the story understood this wasn't penance. It was the beginning of change. Pushing the wheelchair gently into place, Gavin Reed felt a quiet sense of belonging he never expected to find. A month ago, volunteering at the Hartley Hope Foundation had seemed like little more than damage control, a necessary step to salvage his reputation. But something had shifted. Day by day, as he showed up, listened, and learned, the role transformed from obligation to opportunity. Not just to help others, but to rediscover parts of himself he'd long ignored. Across the ballroom, Izzy Hartley approached, graceful in a modest blue dress that reflected the calm strength she carried. Even now, knowing exactly who she was, Gavin still found himself humbled by her presence, not because of her title or wealth, but because of her complete lack of pretense. "How are you finding the experience, Gavin?" she asked gently. He paused, choosing his words with care. "Humbling," he said, "and necessary." Izzy nodded with a quiet smile. "Thomas seems to like you," she added, glancing toward the boy in the wheelchair nearby. "He's been teaching me how to play adaptive basketball," Gavin admitted. "Apparently, I'm terrible at it." Izzy laughed warm, genuine. "He's a brutally honest coach." Gavin's expression turned more serious. "Mrs. Hartley," he began, "I know I've already apologized formally, but I need to say it again, face to face. I'm truly sorry for the way I treated you. There's no excuse." "You're right," Izzy replied, without bitterness. "There isn't. The real question is, what have you learned from it?" He looked down for a moment, then met her gaze again. "That worth doesn't come from appearance or position or possessions, that everyone deserves respect until they give a reason not to, not the other way around. Izzy's eyes softened. Good lessons, she said. Expensive ones, too. I know, Gavin replied, thinking of the business that had been lost after Alexander chose not to purchase the full fleet, but worth every penny. At that moment, Alexander joined them, placing a light hand on Izzy's shoulder. She glanced up at him and said, Gavin was just sharing some things he's come to understand. Alexander nodded. I hear you've been quite involved with the adaptive sports program. Yes, sir. I actually signed up to keep volunteering beyond what I was required to do. He hesitated, then added, and I've been working with Mr. Mason on revising how we approach customers at the dealership. No more judging by the clothes they wear. Alexander's brow lifted slightly in surprise, then softened. I'm glad to hear that. Then, after a brief pause, he added with a small smile, which reminds me that corporate fleet we talked about. We're still in the market. Perhaps you'd like to handle the transaction? Gavin blinked. Me? Yes. Daniel's spoken highly of how you've been mentoring him. For a moment, Gavin didn't know what to say. Then the gratitude settled in, deep and real. I'd be honored, Mr. Hartley. Truly. Later that evening, as the event slowly drew to a close, Gavin watched the Hartleys moving through the room, talking, laughing, listening. They weren't flaunting anything. They were simply present, offering their time, their hearts, and their attention. And Gavin realized just how much his perspective had shifted. Just weeks ago, he would have dismissed someone like Isabel Hartley as a nobody. Now, he knew better. Now, he understood that true worth wasn't measured in suits or salaries, but in compassion, in purpose, in how you treat those you think no one else is watching. Near the photo booth, Thomas grinned up at him as Gavin helped him back into his chair. You know something, Mr. Gavin? The boy said. You're actually pretty cool. For a grown-up. Gavin chuckled, genuinely moved. Coming from you, Thomas, that means more than you know. We all make assumptions based on appearances. But sometimes, if we're lucky like Gavin Reed was, we get the chance to look deeper. And when we do, we just might discover extraordinary people and life-changing truths. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs this reminder today. And tell us, have you ever misjudged someone or been misjudged yourself? Because your story, just like this one, might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Until next time, from all of us at Shining Stories, keep believing in the power of compassion and never underestimate the quiet strength of kindness.